The business class cabin gleamed with light. CEO Richard Hale adjusted his Armani suit cuffs, eyes showing irritation as he looked at the young mother in seat 22A. She wore an old jacket, held a small child, struggled with a worn suitcase in fastening the seatbelt. Richard smirked. Business class allowing people like this? Truly embarrassing. Suddenly, a flock of birds struck the left engine. An explosion roared. The captain was thrown hard into the control panel, unconscious. The first officer panicked. The cabin shook violently. Passengers screamed. The CEO went pale. "We're finished." The mother handed her child to the flight attendant and walked into the cockpit. Her voice rang firm over the radio. "This is Valkyrie One, 210 souls on board. Taking control." On the frequency, an F-22 pilot choked. "Valkyrie?" But she was declared killed in action 5 years ago. Elena Carter, 35 years old, slender frame, hair tied neatly, wearing an old blue jacket. Traveling with her 6-year-old son, Noah, a boy with bright eyes but somewhat thin, prone to breathing difficulties in dry air. Elena lived simply, avoiding attention. To everyone, she was just a single mother. Her past: 5 years ago, Elena had been a NATO ace pilot with the call sign Valkyrie. During a classified mission, her aircraft went missing. A death notice was sent globally. On the National Memorial Wall, her name was engraved, Elena Carter, KIA. The world thought she was dead. Only a few old comrades occasionally whispered, her voice unforgettable. In the cabin, Elena was scrutinized. A middle-aged woman whispered, "How does someone like this get business class?" Richard Hale, wealthy CEO, shook his head. These days, anyone can intrude where they don't belong. Elena remained silent, bowing her head and holding her son, not arguing back. A small gesture. When the flight attendant accidentally dropped a pen, Elena picked it up and returned it with a smile. An elderly passenger would later recount. "In her eyes, I saw a discipline unlike ordinary civilians. But at the time, no one knew who she had been." Act 1 closing. Elena was dismissed, appearing weak in everyone's eyes. But the audience glimpsed her special qualities. The London Heathrow business class lounge was a sanctuary of privilege. Soft leather chairs, complimentary premium alcohol, hushed conversations about mergers and markets. Elena had entered quietly with Noah, using miles she'd accumulated over years of careful saving. This trip to Madrid was for Noah's specialist appointment, a pulmonologist who might finally help with his breathing issues. They'd taken seats in a corner. Elena pulled out a tablet loaded with children's educational games to keep Noah occupied. He played quietly, occasionally coughing into his elbow the way she'd taught him. Richard Hale had been holding court near the coffee station, pontificating to his assistant about quarterly projections. His eyes had swept the lounge dismissively until they'd landed on Elena. Old jacket, discount store shoes, a child who looked underfed. Everything about her screamed, "Doesn't belong." "Look at that," he'd muttered to his assistant, loud enough to be overheard. "This is why I fly private usually. The riffraff gets everywhere now." His assistant had looked uncomfortable but said nothing. You don't contradict Richard Hale if you want to keep your job. At the gate, when boarding was called, Elena had struggled. Noah's small backpack kept slipping off her shoulder while she juggled their carry-on and tried to scan boarding passes. She'd asked the gate agent for just a moment to reorganize. "Some people just aren't cut out for travel," Richard had announced to the line behind him, holding up everyone who actually knows what they're doing. A few passengers had chuckled nervously. Most looked away, embarrassed by his cruelty but unwilling to intervene. Elena had heard every word. Her jaw had tightened almost imperceptibly, but she'd said nothing. Just organized her bags and took Noah's hand and boarded. On the plane, Richard ended up 2 rows behind Elena, close enough to continue his commentary. When Elena struggled to get Noah's seatbelt adjusted properly, the boy squirming because the strap pressed on his chest uncomfortably, Richard had called out, "First time in business class? Maybe stick to economy where you belong." A flight attendant, Maria Santos, had approached to help. "Let me assist you with that." "Thank you," Elena had said quietly. "He has a breathing condition. The pressure needs to be just right." Maria had adjusted it perfectly, then looked at Elena with curiosity. There was something in this woman's bearing, something that didn't match her shabby clothes. Maria would later tell investigators, "I've worked flights for 12 years. You learn to read people. This woman, she sat differently than other passengers. Perfect posture, constant awareness of her surroundings, hands that moved with precision. I thought maybe she was ex-military. I had no idea how right I was." The aircraft entered an area with migrating birds. Suddenly, a massive flock flew directly into the left wing. Bird strike, a violent explosion, smoke pouring from the engine. The cabin lurched, passengers screamed. The captain was thrown hard into the control panel, blood trickling from his forehead, unconscious. The young first officer panicked, hands trembling, shouting, I can't control it." Red warning lights flooded the cabin. Oxygen masks dropped. Children cried. Adults screamed. Richard yelled frantically, "We're all going to die. No one can save us." Elena placed Noah in the chief flight attendant's arms, whispering, "Oh, hold my son tight." She stood up and walked into the cockpit. The first officer tried to stop her. "You can't come in here." But Elena had already slid into the captain's seat, her hands moving across the control panel. Her voice rang clear and firm over the radio. "This is Valkyrie One, 210 souls on board, taking control." F-22 pilots monitoring the frequency fell silent for several seconds, then choked. Valkyrie? But she was declared killed in action 5 years ago. Another F-22 whispered, "I flew under her command." That voice is unmistakable. Chief Flight Attendant Maria would later say, "I was shaking violently, but hearing her voice, I stood up straight." The entire cabin went silent, as if a real commander was there. End of Act 2, Elena had revealed her identity. The crisis was temporarily stabilized, but the big question opened. Why was a dead woman alive? The crisis had erupted at 37,000 feet over southern France. Captain James Morrison, 28 years of commercial flying experience, had been conducting a routine cruise when the radar showed something unusual ahead. "Flock activity," he'd muttered to First Officer Sarah Chen. "Large concentration, birds migrating south." They'd begun standard evasive procedures, requesting a slight altitude change from air traffic control. But the flock was massive. Thousands of Canada geese flying in formation, and the aircraft's path intersected theirs at the worst possible angle. The left engine had ingested perhaps 30 birds in 3 seconds. The turbine blades designed to handle small impacts were overwhelmed. Metal sheared, fuel ignited. The engine exploded in a fireball visible from the cabin windows. The explosion had been so violent that Morrison had been thrown against the control panel, his head striking the edge with a sickening crack. He'd collapsed immediately, blood streaming from a gash above his eye. Sarah Chen, 26 years old, barely 2 years out of flight school, found herself suddenly in command of a dying aircraft. "Mayday, mayday, mayday," she'd transmitted, her voice high with panic. "Transatlantic 892, bird strike, engine failure, captain incapacitated." And she'd tried to follow her training, shut down the damaged engine, increase thrust on the remaining engine, maintain altitude. But the aircraft wasn't responding correctly. The asymmetric thrust was pulling them into a bank. Warning alarms were screaming, and she was alone. In the cabin, pandemonium. The explosion had been loud enough to hear everywhere. The subsequent shuddering, the sudden bank, the oxygen mask dropping, all of it had triggered mass hysteria. People crying, praying, calling loved ones, convinced these were their final moments. Richard Hale had been in the middle of reviewing a presentation on his laptop when the bird strike occurred. His coffee had spilled across his Armani trousers. His laptop had tumbled to the floor. But he hadn't cared about any of that. He'd been too busy screaming, "We're going to crash! Oh God! We're going to die! Someone do something!" His assistant, pale and silent, had just gripped the armrests and closed her eyes. Elena had been reading to Noah when the strike happened. She'd immediately assessed the situation with the instincts of someone who'd lived through 1,000 emergencies. Engine fire, asymmetric thrust, inexperienced pilot in command, aircraft in a developing spin. 3 minutes, maybe 4, before this became unrecoverable. She'd look down at Noah, his small face frightened but trusting. Mommy needs to help the pilots, sweetheart. I need you to be very brave. Are we going to crash, Mommy? Not if I can help it. She'd kissed his forehead. I love you. Remember that. She'd handed him to Maria, who'd appeared in the aisle trying to maintain order. Keep him safe. Maria had nodded, seeing something in Elena's eyes that overrode all questions. Elena had walked to the cockpit, her movements steady despite the aircraft's violent motion. She'd entered the emergency override code, something she still remembered from military training. The door had opened. Sarah Chen had looked up, tears streaming down her face. I can't do this. I'm going to kill everyone. Move, Elena had said calmly. I'm a pilot. Let me help. You're a passenger. I can't. You can and you will. Now move. The authority in Elena's voice had cut through Sarah's panic. She'd shifted to the first officer's seat. Elena had slid into the captain's chair. Her hands had found the controls like coming home. 5 years away, and it all came back in an instant. She'd scanned the instruments. Engine 1 destroyed. Engine 2 at maximum thrust. Hydraulics compromised. Altitude dropping. Airspeed erratic. She'd reached for the radio, switched to the NATO emergency frequency that she'd once monitored daily, and transmitted. This is Valkyrie One, 210 souls on board. Taking control. At NATO Air Command in Brussels, a controller had frozen. Did she just say Valkyrie One? Running authentication, another responded. But sir, Valkyrie One was declared KIA 5 years ago. Elena Carter, memorial service, official death certificate, everything. Then who the hell is flying that plane? Above France, Captain Jake Reaper Morrison was flying to patrol in his F-22. He'd been monitoring civilian frequencies as part of routine airspace protection when he'd heard the Mayday call. Then he'd heard something else, a call sign that made his blood run cold. Control, this is Reaper. Did I just hear Valkyrie One on commercial frequency? Affirmative, Reaper. We're trying to verify. No need to verify, Reaper interrupted. I'd know that voice anywhere. That's Commander Carter. She's alive, and she's flying that bird. News of the call sign Valkyrie immediately spread through military systems. F-22 pilots discussed, impossible, she's really Valkyrie? In the cabin, Richard sat frozen, remembering the mocking words he'd just said. Elena operated skillfully, adjusting wings, descending altitude, giving brief orders to the first officer. Passengers looked at each other in shock. Who is she? The past revealed, 5 years ago, during a classified mission, Elena's aircraft was hit by a missile. The government declared her dead to cover up the incident, but she survived, spent 5 years living anonymously, raising her son alone. Richard trembled, whispering, You're really Valkyrie? Elena glanced at him, her voice cold. You said business class wasn't for me. Do you still think that? Richard bowed his head, saying nothing more. F-22s flew alongside, banking their wings, the ritual salute to a former commander. The sight sent chills through everyone. End of Act 2, Elena guided the aircraft out of danger, regaining complete control. The entire system and audience acknowledged Valkyrie had returned. The authentication had taken 45 seconds. Voice pattern analysis, biometric comparison to archived recordings, cross-reference with classified operational codes that only Valkyrie would know. Every check came back positive. Confirmed, NATO command transmitted. Valkyrie One authenticated. Commander Carter, you're cleared for emergency protocols. Elena had allowed herself the briefest smile. After 5 years of hiding, of pretending to be dead, her real identity was back. She'd turned her attention to the immediate problem, landing a crippled aircraft. First Officer Chen, she'd said calmly, I need you to assist me. Can you do that? Sarah had nodded, her panic subsiding now that someone competent was in command. Yes, ma'am. Good. I need you to coordinate with air traffic control. Tell them we're declaring an emergency and need priority landing at Madrid. Tell them we have one engine out, partial hydraulic failure, and an incapacitated captain. Yes, ma'am. Sarah had begun transmitting, her voice steadier now. Elena had worked the problem methodically. Compensate for the asymmetric thrust using rudder. Reduce airspeed to minimize stress on the damaged wing. Calculate the glide ratio with one engine. She'd flown planes with worse damage in combat. This was survivable. In the cabin, word had spread. The woman from 22A is flying the plane. She's a pilot. No, not just a pilot. She's military. They're calling her Valkyrie. People had pulled out phones, searched the name. Within minutes, they'd found archived articles from 5 years ago. NATO pilot presumed dead after classified mission goes wrong. Elena Valkyrie Carter, memorial service held for fallen hero. Lost legend, the fighter pilot who never came home. And now, pictures of that memorial. The flag-draped, empty coffin. The eulogy. The tears of her squadron. All of it for a woman who was currently sitting in the cockpit of their aircraft, saving their lives. Richard Hale had read the articles with shaking hands. His face had gone from pale to gray. The woman he'd mocked, the mother he'd dismissed as riffraff. She was a decorated military pilot, a combat veteran, someone who'd been declared a national hero, and he'd treated her like garbage. His assistant had looked at him with something like disgust. You were really cruel to her. Richard couldn't respond. Shame had closed his throat. Maria, the flight attendant holding Noah, had brought the boy to where he could see into the cockpit through the open door. See, sweetheart, your mommy's helping everyone. Noah, wide-eyed, had watched his mother's hands moving confidently over controls. My mommy can fly anything, he'd said proudly. The F-22s had arrived within minutes of Elena's transmission, 4 of them appearing on either side of the commercial jet like guardian angels. Captain Reaper had positioned himself where Elena could see him through the cockpit window. He'd waggled his wings, the traditional greeting between pilots. Elena had smiled despite the stress. Reaper, you old dog, still flying? Still alive, ma'am. Unlike you, apparently. We're going to have a long conversation about that after you land this bird. Looking forward to it. Right now, I need you to run interference with Madrid Tower. Tell them Valkyrie One is in command, and I need everything they've got on the ground for this landing. Copy that. You're getting the full treatment. Fire trucks, ambulances, the works. Perfect. Oh, and Reaper, tell them I'm bringing her in. No doubt. Never had any, ma'am. The tension in the cabin had shifted. The initial terror had been replaced by something else. Hope and curiosity. And for many, shame. How many of them had judged Elena in the boarding lounge? How many had looked at her shabby jacket and dismissed her as unworthy of their space? And now she was saving all of them. Elena had begun the descent, her hands steady, her voice calm over the radio as she coordinated with Madrid Tower. Transatlantic 892, you're cleared for emergency landing runway 32 left. One's at 280 at 15 knots. Emergency vehicle standing by. Copy, 32 left. We'll need medical for the captain. Possible head trauma. Ambulance is standing by. Valkyrie, it's an honor to have you on frequency. Elena had paused, touched despite herself. Thank you, Tower. The honor is bringing these people home safely. She'd lined up for approach, compensating for the crosswind with the damaged aircraft's reduced control authority. It was delicate work, the kind that required instinct as much as skill. 20 minutes later, the runway appeared ahead. Elena had guided the plane down, flared perfectly, and the wheels had kissed the ground with barely a bump. The cabin had erupted, not with screams this time, but with crying, relief, gratitude, joy. Richard Hale had put his face in his hands and sobbed. On the ground, emergency vehicles had followed the aircraft as it rolled to a stop. When Elena finally shut down the remaining engine, the silence had been profound. She'd turned to Sarah Chen. You did well. Don't let this shake your confidence. These situations are rare, and you stayed functional throughout. That's what matters. Sarah had wiped her eyes. Thank you for everything. You saved us all. Just doing what I was trained to do. Elena had stood, stretched her stiff shoulders, and stepped out of the cockpit. The cabin had fallen silent as she emerged. Every passenger had turned to look at her. Elena had walked down the aisle to where Maria held Noah. She'd taken her son in her arms, held him tight and whispered, "We're okay, baby. We're okay." The cabin had remained silent as she carried Noah toward the exit. But as she passed each row, passengers had stood, not to applaud, just to show respect. Some nodded, some touched her shoulder, some whispered, "Thank you." Richard Hale had stood as she approached his row. He'd opened his mouth, closed it, then finally managed, "I'm sorry for what I said, for how I treated you. I'm so very sorry." Elena had looked at him, not with anger, just with calm assessment. "Now you know. Don't judge people by their clothes or circumstances. You never know who they really are." She'd continued walking, leaving Richard standing there, diminished and changed. The plane landed safely in Madrid. No one clapped loudly. Everyone silently made way for Elena to exit. The image of her carrying her son, walking down the long aisle with passengers bowing their heads on both sides. European media exploded. Woman declared dead 5 years ago saved 210 lives. Richard wrote publicly, "Today, I was saved by the person I once scorned. I apologize." The call sign Valkyrie went viral on social media, becoming a symbol of courage. The story dominated headlines within hours, not just in Europe, but globally. The combination of elements made it irresistible. A dead hero returning, a class conflict exposed, a dramatic rescue, redemption, and revelation. Dead pilot saves 210. The woman they declared KIA is alive. She was mocked in business class, then she saved everyone's life. Valkyrie returns, the 5-year mystery of Elena Carter. Richard Hale's company PR team had contacted him immediately. "Sir, this is going to be a crisis. You need to get ahead of it." Richard had stared at his phone, reading the tweets already circulating. Passengers on the flight had posted immediately upon landing. His mockery was being shared, discussed, condemned. He'd made a decision. He'd posted a statement on his personal social media. "Today, I was saved by a woman I treated with contempt. Elena Carter, call sign Valkyrie, endured my cruelty with dignity. She had every reason to let me suffer for my behavior. Instead, she saved my life, along with 209 others. I am ashamed of how I acted. I am grateful beyond words for her skill and courage. And I am committed to being a better person. Thank you, Commander Carter. I am sorry, Peg." The post went viral immediately. Millions of shares, thousands of comments. Some praised his humility. Others noted he shouldn't have been cruel in the first place. Richard accepted both. But more broadly, the story sparked conversations about class, judgment, and hidden strength. Military forums exploded with discussion of Valkyrie. Her former squadron members came forward with stories of her legendary skill and leadership. "She was the best combat pilot of her generation," one retired colonel stated. "When she was declared KIA, we lost someone irreplaceable. Learning she's alive and still capable of this level of flying? It's incredible." NATO faced uncomfortable questions. Why had Elena been declared dead? What was the classified mission that allegedly killed her? Why had she been living anonymously for 5 years? A spokesperson issued a carefully worded statement. "The circumstances of Commander Carter's disappearance 5 years ago remain classified for national security reasons. We are grateful she is safe and commend her actions in saving civilian lives." It satisfied no one but revealed nothing. Elena herself had disappeared. After landing, she'd been debriefed briefly by Spanish authorities, checked by medical personnel to ensure she and Noah were unharmed, then had simply left. No interviews, no press conferences, just gone. But her impact remained. Aviation schools added her emergency landing to case studies. Exceptional piloting under catastrophic circumstances with years away from flying. This demonstrates that true skill is permanent. Women's organizations celebrated her as an icon. She broke barriers as a female fighter pilot, was declared dead, lived in poverty as a single mother, and still had the skill and courage to save 210 people. She represents everything we aspire to. Online, the story resonated with millions who'd felt dismissed, underestimated, or judged unfairly. "I'm a single dad working as a janitor," one man posted. "People look at me like I'm nothing. This story reminds me that I'm more than what others see." A woman wrote, I'm a veteran struggling with PTSD. I work retail now. Customers are rude because I look too young and healthy to have served. Elena Carter shows that you can't judge someone's story by looking at them. The message was clear and powerful. Don't assume. Don't judge. You never know who someone really is. Noah's breathing condition received offers of free treatment from specialists worldwide. Elena had tried to refuse, but a pulmonologist from Madrid had insisted, "Your mother saved 210 people. Let us help save one. Let us help your son." NATO had quietly reached out, offering to reinstate her with full rank and honors. Elena had declined. "I did my service. I'm a mother now. That's my mission." They'd understood. They'd sent her a medal anyway, presented privately before she left Madrid. For extraordinary courage and piloting skill under emergency circumstances, saving 210 civilian lives. Elena had accepted it, then tucked it in her bag next to Noah's inhaler and children's books, because that's who she was. Valkyrie and mom, hero and human, both, always both. If you believe true strength isn't about circumstances, type, "I will live with kindness." Elena declined all interviews, quietly disappearing with her son. People only remembered the firm voice from the cockpit. "This is Valkyrie One, 210 souls on board." An F-22 pilot wrote, "The greatest revenge isn't shouting at those who scorn you, but saving them so they must see the truth." The symbolic closure, Valkyrie's memorial, was no longer an ending, but the beginning of a living legend. The lesson: true strength lies not in status or position, but in skill, will, and courage. 3 months later, Elena was living in a small town in southern Spain. She'd chosen it for Noah's health, the warm, dry climate good for his lungs. The specialist treatment was helping. He was getting stronger every day. She'd taken a job as a flight instructor at a local aviation school. Small planes, basic lessons, nothing like her fighter pilot days. But it kept her in the air, and it was peaceful. One afternoon, a young woman arrived for her first lesson. She was nervous, clearly not wealthy, wearing clothes that had seen better days. "I'm sorry," the woman said. "I know I probably don't look like I belong here. I've been saving for 2 years for these lessons. I'll work really hard." Elena smiled. "You belong here exactly as much as anyone else. More, actually, because you wanted it enough to sacrifice for it." "What's your name?" "Carmen." "Nice to meet you, Carmen. I'm Elena. Let's fly." They'd spent 2 hours in the air. Elena had discovered Carmen was talented, a natural feel for the controls, good instincts. After landing, Elena said, "You're going to be an excellent pilot." Carmen's eyes had filled with tears. "Really? You think so?" "I know so. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." It was only later that Carmen learned who Elena was. When she realized her instructor was Valkyrie, she'd been speechless. "Why didn't you tell me?" Carmen asked at the next lesson. "Because it doesn't matter," Elena said simply. "I'm just a pilot teaching another pilot. Everything else is noise." Richard Hale, meanwhile, had made significant changes. He'd stepped back from his CEO role to focus on philanthropy. He'd established scholarships for single parents pursuing education, never publicly connecting it to Elena, though everyone knew. He couldn't undo his cruelty, but he could try to be better going forward. 1 year after the incident, he received a letter from Elena. "Mr. Hale," it read, "I've heard about your scholarship program. That's good work. I don't need apologies anymore. What happened taught us both lessons. You learned not to judge. I learned I couldn't hide from who I am. We both grew. That's enough. I hope you continue to grow and help others grow. That's the best any of us can do. Respectfully, Elena Carter." Richard framed that letter and kept it in his office as a permanent reminder. NATO created the Valkyrie Award for Emergency Aviation Excellence, given annually to pilots who demonstrated exceptional skill during crisis situations. Elena attended the first ceremony, watched a young pilot receive the award, felt proud. Not for herself, but for what it represented. Recognition that heroism comes from unexpected people. Noah grew stronger. His lung function improved. He could run, play, live normally. On his 8th birthday, he asked, "Mommy, will you teach me to fly someday?" Elena thought about it, about the sky that had given her so much joy and pain, about the responsibility of passing on that knowledge. Yes, she said finally, but first you need to understand something. Flying isn't about the plane or even the sky. It's about responsibility. Every time you fly, you're responsible for lives. It's a sacred trust. Noah nodded seriously, like when you saved all those people. Exactly like that. I want to be like you. Elena pulled him close. You already are. You're brave and kind, and you don't give up. That's all Valkyrie ever was. Someone who refused to give up. The memorial with her name remained at NATO headquarters, but they'd added a plaque beneath it. Declared KIA 2019, returned 2024. Some legends refuse to die. Elena had seen it once, smiled slightly, and walked away, because she wasn't a legend, or a ghost, or a symbol. She was just Elena. Mother, pilot, survivor. And that was more than enough. If you believe in stories that touch the heart like this one, leave a comment. And don't forget to subscribe to SN Touching Stories. We tell the stories that shouldn't be forgotten.